Now, what you see here is that section 5 of the paper says some implications for economic issues, which implies that the sections before were not exclusively concerned with economics. It was more general, and this is how he understands it. So this discussion about the role of assumptions, he intends it to be more general, and now he comes to the specifics of economics, namely what this general discussion, what the implications of the general discussion are, and then we come nearer to economics and to these issues. Now, the foregoing discussion, and this is something which is very important to him, is relevant for the criticism that orthodox economics is unrealistic. Right? This is something which you may have heard, well, since childhood, and sociologists and psychologists have been telling that, economics, the economic man, this is unrealistic, and therefore all of economics is very strange. And then economists say you do not understand what we are doing, and that discussion didn't move anything. It did started moving in the last 20, 30 years due to behavioral economics, but before it was completely sterile, and it was apparently also a discussion within economics about these assumptions, for instance, like selfish and money-grubbing homo economicus, full information in markets, perfect markets, etc. And the criticism, he says, concerning the unrealisticness of these assumptions is a false, misled criticism. And the criticism probably brought from within and without economics. This is seen with these examples that he said when people tried to criticize, the behavior of managers, that it was assumed in neoclassical theory as purely rational, and said people, we've got to have a better theory about that. That's unrealistic, and therefore we should do it empirically. And he says, no, that's a wrong way of going forwards. The criticism is besides the point. This is what he's saying. This is very important. So every criticism of the unrealisticness of assumptions is besides the point and would be only valid if there were alternative hypotheses with better predictions. This is the measure. So this idea that Friedman, the standard of quality of hypothesis is predictions, that's correct, which is the common assumption. The instrumentalism is not correct, we will see. But this is, of course, right, and he says, if you want to have an argument why this assumption is better than the other, it's not sufficient to say this assumption is more realistic than the other one. That's not an argument, but you got to deliver better predictions. This is what he's saying. So here we are, behavior of businessmen according to theory, neoclassic theory, of course, versus their testimony and descriptive studies. Right? So what you're building up there, a realistic theory of businessmen, he says, that's only valid if you really get better predictions. If not, forget it. And a theory can, in the end, possibly never be fully realistic, be realistic. There are much too many details. That's quite clear. Because even if you say now we investigate empirically the business people, then we generalize and say they are such and such. Of course, that's not true. If you take thousands of them, then you only have the average or whatever. You can't model it one by one and then really do psychoanalysis with every single one for 5 years and then know enough. So you never do that. So a theory can never be fully realistic. Every theory is always abstract in some sense, in all disciplines. Also the descriptive disciplines like history. Everything is always abstract because every individual is ineffable. So there are just infinitely many features and relations, and we can never gather that, and science shouldn't do that. The usual criticism is the assumptions are too unrealistic and should be replaced by more realistic ones, and that is something which Friedman does not accept in that form. The question being that how he's treating that subject, how can we assess assumptions as being too unrealistic or being enough realistic? What's the way? How can we decide that as economists now? Can only be done by the differences in predictive power. Right? This is again the same story. That whole paper does have one or two messages, and once you get them, it's a very simple paper. It's very clear and very simple once you get the messages. So he says the only way to assess then the quality of the assumptions is by differences in predictive power. And this is the mistake that people are making, is This is what he's saying. Those people who try to criticize economic theory by criticizing the unrealisticness of assumptions is a basic confusion between descriptive accuracy and analytical relevance. Remember that passage I mentioned already, and then it was not understandable there. That's the point. He's saying it's one thing that something is descriptively accurate, and this is different from being analytically relevant, whatever that means. We're going to find out what that means, right? Analytically relevant. So for instance, for example, he says, because economic phenomena are complex, therefore economic theory must be complex. This is one of these ideas that the critics of economic theory bring forward, and he says that's a wrong idea, right? This is just not how science works, including economics. Fundamental hypothesis of science, he says, they take into account that appearances are deceptive because superficially disconnected and diverse phenomena may be manifestations of a more fundamental and relatively simple structure. So this is again a rather general statement about science, and that you can apply to chemistry and physics and biology and many other disciplines. Sociology, you can apply there, that what he's saying there, the appearances are deceptive in the sense that they are superficially disconnected and diverse. And what you want to find out in science is something underlying, something more simple that explains then something. So if you take in the 17th century the theory of gravitation, Newton's theory of gravitation, then Newton saw that the diverse phenomena of falling apples or falling things toward the ground and the tides and the motion of the planets, which look all very different from each other, right? Falling apple, what's that a falling apple to do with the tides? What has that to do with the motion of planets? And Newton said, look, it's all the effect of gravitation. I write down the law and then I can deduce all these phenomena from the law, right? Plus boundary conditions. So this is the idea, that you have diverse phenomena, and the point of science is getting, so to speak, to the core, to some underlying fundamental structure, whatever. What does he call it? Manifestance of a more, fundamental and relatively simple structure. For instance, the structure of gravitation. You write down Newton's law of gravitation, and then you can explain why the apple falls, why like it falls, why the tides are there, because there's the moon, and then you have the gravitational force from the moon, and why the planets move the way they do in ellipses, that you can deduce from Newton's theory. So you get Kepler's laws from Newton's theory. This is what he has in mind here. So the fundamental hypothesis, therefore this idea that economic phenomena are complex, therefore economic theory must be complex, is just a misunderstanding what science is all about. This is what he's claiming here, and he's certainly not completely wrong here. Now he says something which I'm concentrating later. More ideal types in the abstract model have been regarded as strictly descriptive categories, and this is a misunderstanding of economic theories. So something falls here from the sky, namely the term ideal types, and he says abstract models contain ideal types, and they have been regarded as descriptive categories, which is a misunderstanding of economic theories. And the examples he brings is the example from economist Marshall, the concept of perfect competition and of monopoly. This is again the firm example, and he says that Marshall brings forward these terms, and they are ideal types, right? And they are whatever they are. I come back to that. And they are ideal types, and one should not think that perfect competition is a descriptive term for any sort of firm or situation of firms, but it is an analytic category, or he calls it ideal types. And there are extremes, and real markets are always in between. This is what he's saying, right? I'm just echoing here Friedman. So he says, we have in economic theory, for instance, perfect competition and monopoly. Don't think that perfect competition and monopoly describes real situations. No, it's an idealization. It's called an ideal type. And if you look at the real firms, then they're somehow in between. Real markets are in between perfect competition and monopoly. This is what he's saying. So you should not then criticize a hypothesis that uses perfect competition because perfect competition doesn't exist. That's the wrong sort of criticism, he's saying. Like when you say in free fall, don't criticize it because we don't have a vacuum for that ball. That's besides the point. Right? You've got to criticize it if you want to criticize it in a different way. And then he describes Marshall as using ideal types as an engine to analyze the world. So they are the fundamental tools, is what he's saying here. Ideal types are the fundamental tools to analyze the social world, or here the world of economics, right? A hypothesis consists of the abstract model containing ideal types. So this is now, we see that we have the abstract model. Remember that for the free fall case, the abstract model is just the equation of free fall. For the firms, it's just either absolute total competition or total monopoly. We have that abstract model, and then that containing ideal types, like these, what he calls extremes, plus the more or less implicit rules suggested by examples, how to identify real firms with the appropriate ideal type. This is more or less the same that what he said before. You know, you have these two parts, the ideal model, the abstract model, and then you have these rules, incomplete, how to apply these rules to situations which are not exactly like the ideal model, but only approximately so or similar to, and then you have to learn with examples how to do that, and you cannot finally formalize these rules for application because they are open-ended. This is what he's saying. And here comes very clear description what he means. The ideal types are not intended to be descriptive. They are designed to isolate the features that are crucial for a particular problem. Right? You have a particular problem, then you've got to find the ideal types, meaning the ideal types then bringing to the fore what are the the most important forces for that particular situation. So for the free fall example, you have many, many other forces as well, electrical forces, magnetic forces, if this one falls to the ground. But you say, forget about it, I forget about friction, forget about everything. The relevant force here is the most relevant is gravitation, and therefore I use this abstract model, gravitation idealized near the Earth in free fall in a vacuum, right? And then I use this abstract model, and I show you a few examples where you can use it, and then you play around with them yourself. So this is the idea of ideal types here. And then, very important, again, I can only recommend that again and again, it's always problem dependent. Whether a given firm is treated as in perfect competition or as a monopolist depends on the problem. One and the same firm is once treated as a monopolist and in another situation as in perfect competition, depending on the question that you are asking. And here's the example, cigarette firms. Again, interesting case. The question is, first question, what is the effect of tax increase on cigarette prices? So every firm is, of course, then targeted by tax increase. And there he says, treating cigarettes firms as if in perfect competition will give roughly the right results. So you will find, if you say, okay, tax increased, then price must increase somehow, and then if you say, how will the firms behave, and then you assume they are in perfect competition, and then he says, this will give you roughly the right results. But in a different situation, which happened in the United States, namely you had a price control during World War II, and then the firms cannot be treated as in perfect competition. If you got a cap for the prices, then firms will behave differently. Right? And it's not that you can derive their behavior from perfect competition. I cannot judge the appropriateness of the case, but this is not completely implausible, that it just depends on the situation, whether it's enough to know this force, namely in that particular case, the competitive part in which the firms are, or whether that aspect of competition is not enough to explain the reaction of the firms. Then you have perhaps to look at particulars of the firms or groups of firms that they will behave differently. Now, he refers to Marshall here most of the time in this section. So Marshall's theory is good for cases in which firms can indeed be treated as if in perfect competition. They are not in perfect competition, but they can be treated as if in certain competition, namely in particular situations in which that works. There are other situations in which it doesn't work. So he did not assume perfect competition in the normal sense of assuming. So he does not say, yes, these firms are indeed, in reality, in perfect competition. No, they are not. And he knows it, right? But you can treat them. And that's the same way when I say this thing falls to the ground, and I use the fall of the Galileo law of free fall. I'm not saying this is a case of vacuum. I know it's not. But I can treat it as if, and I get good results that are good enough. And this is exactly the same what he's saying, and this is much more general for him. This is how economic theory works. You use then these ideal types, I come back to them, and then you can treat situations as if there were such and such, and then you apply the model, an abstract model for this situation. The situation is not as the model describes, it's a difference, but for certain situations it may be good. So he does not deny, of course, it would be desirable to have a more general theory than Marshall's, because Marshall can only treat situations in which the situation is as if the firms were in perfect competition. But there are cases which cannot be treated in that way, and it would be good to have a more general theory in which you take on board also other aspects of firms in order to describe their behavior, because it's not everything, right? A perfect competition is not everything. There's a candidate by Chamberlain and Robinson. I don't know this theory, but it's insufficient on many counts, and he just dismisses it. He just says, yeah, people have tried to develop that, but it doesn't do the jobs because the predictions weren't better. Right? This is the measure. So you don't judge intuitively whether your assumptions are okay or good enough for the case. You've got to find out whether you get better predictions or not. So this is the basic message, and then the conclusions are as follows. Theories in economics are always tentative. They predict consequences of changes in circumstances. This is according to what I said, also in the beginning, what he said, that this is why we have positive economics, because we want to predict what happens if I change circumstances. Therefore, I need these hypotheses. Unfortunately, he says, there are no experiments in economics. Remember 1953? This was decades before the advent of experimental economics. So he's absolutely right about that. And therefore, there is in economics less clear-cut evidence for tentative hypotheses than in physics or other experimental sciences. Right? And there again, he's right, because you cannot manipulate situations as in experiments and then get evidence that decide upon the fate of your hypotheses. The fundamental methodological principle is that hypotheses can be tested only by conformity of their implications with observations and nothing else. No direct testing of assumptions. And scientific hypotheses or theories typically assert that certain forces are relevant for a given class of phenomena and others irrelevant. So this is this abstracting feature that economic theory does and also physical theory does, and all other, also the purely descriptive or more descriptive theories like history or so. They're all abstract from things and all have to make decisions. What is the important stuff and what's the unimportant stuff that I leave out? Right? You always have to abstract whatever you do there in science. This assertion can be formulated by means of an as-if sentence. As-if sentence, phenomena occur as if the world contained only the relevant forces. So when you describe what economists or physicists or so are doing, you can also say they treat this situation as if. And then the as-if licenses the use of an abstract model that has abstracted from all the rest. Right? Such as if assumptions that cannot be tested by comparison with reality, such cannot be tested, there's that too much. They cannot be tested by comparison with reality. Clearly, that's like I treat it as if it fell in a vacuum, then I cannot say, is this a vacuum or not? No, it's not. I know it's not, but I cannot directly test it. The only measure to assess their quality is the accuracy of prediction based on them. And therefore, much of the criticism of economic theory as unrealistic is thus irrelevant, right? This is a fairly strong statement. And that concerns not only the criticism from outside, sociologists, psychologists who say, you got unrealistic models of human agents. He says, I don't care. That's not the question. The question is whether they are good enough for particular situations. Then his own personal view there is the present state of positive economics, that relative price theory and static monetary theory are okay, in contrast to monetary dynamics, so he's unhappy about that, and there are new hypotheses are needed, they must be generated by a creative act. Okay, so this is the story, and there are still quite a few problems open, I guess,